In the small town of Kaliro, life had once been warm and safe for Naledi. She was a bright young girl, full of laughter, until fate took her mother away too soon. The house that had once echoed with love suddenly felt empty. Naledi's father, trying to fill the silence, brought home a new wife named Mbalanal. To the outside world, Mbalanal looked like the perfect woman, graceful, polite, and always smiling. Neighbors praised her beauty and kindness, believing Naledi was lucky to have such a stepmother. But behind the closed doors of their home, a different story unfolded. At first, Naledi thought things would get better. She hoped Mbalanal would treat her like a daughter, or at least as family. But instead, the woman's smile turned cold whenever no one else was watching. Her words, sharp and bitter, cut into Naledi's young heart. She spoke sweetly when her husband was around, but when he left for work in the fields, she showed Naledi no affection, only disapproval. The girl learned to hide her pain, holding back tears that burned her eyes. She remembered her mother's gentle love and often cried quietly at night, clutching the small shawl her mother had left behind. The neighbors sometimes whispered, noticing that Naledi's cheerful spirit seemed dimmer, but no one dared to question Mbalanal. In silence, Naledi carried her sorrow, praying each day that one day her stepmother's heart would soften, though deep down she feared it never would. At first, Mbalanal's cruelty was hidden in little things, the kind that most people would not notice. She started by taking away Naledi's favorite dresses, claiming they were too bright or too grown-up for her. Naledi would watch helplessly as her stepmother folded the dresses and locked them away in a wooden chest. The girl's heart would ache, but she stayed quiet, afraid that speaking up would only make things worse. Then came the books. Naledi loved reading. It was her escape, her way of feeling close to her late mother, who used to tell her stories at night. One evening, when Mbalanal found her reading instead of washing dishes quickly enough, she snatched the book from Naledi's hands and threw it into the fire. Naledi stood frozen, watching the pages curl into ashes, tears burning in her eyes, but she said nothing. The punishments grew harsher. If Naledi spilled a little water while fetching it from the well, she was called careless. If she came home a few minutes late from school, she was accused of being lazy or ungrateful. Even when she worked hard, scrubbing floors until her hands turned red, Mbalanal found faults. Nothing was ever enough. Every mistake, no matter how small, became a reason for harsh words. Naledi's father never saw these moments. He worked long hours in the fields, returning home tired and hungry. By then, Mbalanal would act like a loving wife and stepmother, serving him food with a sweet smile and speaking gently to Naledi in front of him. Naledi often thought of telling her father the truth, but when she looked at his tired face, she stayed silent. She didn't want to add to his burdens. So she carried her pain quietly, hiding it behind forced smiles. At night, she lay awake in her small bed, clutching the memory of her mother's voice, whispering to herself that tomorrow might be better. Deep inside, she kept hoping that one day, her stepmother would soften, that maybe love would grow where cruelty lived. But as the days passed, those small signs of hatred only grew stronger, and Naledi felt herself slipping into a lonely world where her only companion was hope, a fragile hope that seemed to fade a little more each day. One evening, the air in Kaliro was heavy with the sound of drums and chatter as elders gathered near the courtyard. They spoke of many things: crops, the weather, the children of the town. But when Naledi's name was mentioned, their voices softened with admiration. They praised her intelligence, her gentle manners, and the grace that reminded them of her late mother. Some even whispered that Naledi would grow into a woman far more respected than her stepmother. Mbalanal stood nearby, pretending to smile, but inside her heart twisted with anger. Every word of praise for Naledi felt like a knife cutting into her pride. She had worked so hard to appear perfect before the town, and yet, they saw through her false charm. They admired the girl she secretly despised. As jealousy consumed her, dark thoughts began to grow in her mind. By the time the night fell quiet, Mbalanal had already made a plan. Later, when the house grew still and Naledi's father slept, Mbalanal entered the small kitchen. She moved carefully, her hands trembling as she opened a hidden pouch. Inside was a fine white powder she had kept for months, a powder she had once heard could stop a heart if swallowed. She poured hot water into 2 cups, added tea leaves, and then, with a cold determination, slipped the powder into one of the cups. The steam carried a faint, bitter scent, but she quickly stirred it until it disappeared. She carried the tray into the room where Naledi sat quietly, finishing some schoolwork by the dim light of a lamp. With the sweetest smile she could fake, Balinal placed the cup in front of her and said softly, "My child, you study too much. Drink this. It will make you strong." Her voice was honey, but her eyes betrayed a strange eagerness, as if she could not wait to see the girl take a sip. Naledi looked up, surprised at the sudden kindness. For a brief moment, she thought maybe her prayers had been answered, that her stepmother's heart was finally softening. She smiled shyly and reached for the cup, but as she lifted it, the warm steam touched her nose, and something inside her stirred with unease. The smell was not like the tea she knew, and when she glanced at Balinal, she noticed how her stepmother's hand shook ever so slightly, her eyes locked on the cup as if her whole life depended on it. In that moment, Naledi remembered her grandmother's old warning, "When envy enters a home, even food becomes dangerous." Her heart began to race, but she kept her face calm. She knew something was terribly wrong. Holding the cup in her hands, she forced a small smile, hiding her fear, and whispered silently to herself, "Not tonight, not like this." Naledi held the cup close to her lips, but her heart began to beat faster. Something felt strange, something she couldn't ignore. The tea smelled faintly bitter, not like the sweet, comforting aroma she was used to. It was sharp, almost sour, as if the leaves had been burned. She glanced at her stepmother, who was standing too close, her hands pressed together, her eyes fixed on Naledi in a way that made her skin crawl. Balinal's smile was wide, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile that hid something darker. Naledi's hands trembled slightly as she remembered her grandmother's words. "When envy enters a home, even food becomes dangerous." Those words, spoken years ago by the fire, now echoed in her mind like a warning bell. She had brushed them aside as a child, but now, sitting with this cup in her hand, they made sense. She lowered the cup slowly, pretending she was only cooling the tea, while her eyes searched Balinal's face. Balinal leaned forward. "Drink, child," she said softly, though her voice carried an edge of impatience. "It will give you strength." Her tone was sweet, but her eyes gave her away. They were filled with a hunger, as if she was desperate to see Naledi swallow that tea. Naledi felt a chill run down her spine. Why was her stepmother so eager? Why were her hands shaking if this was just ordinary tea? For a moment, Naledi thought of her father. If she fell ill, or worse, who would protect her? Who would tell him the truth? She realized she was alone in this moment, standing at the edge of something dangerous. Her young mind worked quickly. She could not show fear. If Balinal saw hesitation, she might force her to drink. Naledi knew she had to be clever, just as her grandmother had once told her. Strength is not always in the body, but in the mind. So Naledi smiled faintly, hiding the storm inside her. She set the cup down on the tray and said softly, "It is too hot, Mama. Let me wait a little." She pushed her schoolwork aside, acting calm, though her heart raced so loudly she feared it would give her away. Balinal's eyes flickered with irritation. She forced a laugh, as if she wasn't in a hurry, but Naledi could see the tension in her jaw. The room felt heavier, the silence thick. Naledi's hands rested lightly on the table, but inside, she was already thinking of a way out. The tea sat there, steaming, between them like a silent enemy. Naledi understood now. This was not an act of kindness, not a gift of love. It was a trap, and if she made the wrong move, it could be her last. Naledi sat very still, her mind racing. The tea in front of her felt like fire, not because of its heat but because of the danger she sensed inside it. She knew if she lifted it to her lips, her life might end in that very moment. But she also knew she could not let her stepmother see her fear. She needed to think fast, to act calm, to turn this trap into something else. She leaned back in her chair and pretended to yawn. "Mama," she said softly, "I think I should wash my hands before I drink. My books make them dusty." With slow movements, she set the cup back onto the tray. Balinal forced a smile and nodded, though her eyes never left the cup. When Naledi stood up, her mind formed a quiet plan. She noticed that Mbalanal had poured 2 cups of tea, one for herself and one for Naledi. The second cup sat untouched on the tray. As she reached for her school papers, she moved carefully, her fingers steady though her heart pounded. With a small, natural motion, she switched the 2 cups, placing the poisoned one closer to Mbalanal and sliding the safe one toward herself. It was such a simple act, almost invisible, but in Naledi's eyes, it felt like the bravest thing she had ever done. She returned to her seat, picked up the safe cup, and held it in her hands with a gentle smile. Then she looked at Mbalanal, her voice calm but her words sharp like a hidden blade. "Mama," she said sweetly, "you always tell me that good things should be shared. You should drink first, so we can both grow strong together." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mbalanal froze, her smile faltering. Her eyes darted to the cup now placed before her, the same cup she had laced with poison. For a moment she seemed caught between pride and fear. She could not refuse without raising suspicion. Naledi's innocent face made it impossible to say no. If she protested, the girl might guess the truth, and then everything would collapse. So Mbalanal laughed awkwardly and reached for the cup. "Ah, you are such a thoughtful child," she muttered, her voice strained. She lifted it slowly, her fingers trembling, and brought it close to her lips. Naledi watched quietly, her heart pounding, but her face calm as stone. "Drink, Mama," Naledi whispered, her eyes shining not with fear, but with a strange strength. And in that moment, the trap that had been set for the daughter turned back on the stepmother. The poisoned cup, meant to end Naledi's story, now sat in Mbalanal's hands, waiting to write a new one. Mbalanal held the cup in her hands, her fingers tightening around it. For a brief moment, she thought of pushing it away, of making some excuse. But Naledi's soft eyes were watching her, steady and innocent. If she refused, the girl might suspect everything. And if she admitted the truth, her mask as the perfect wife and stepmother would shatter. Pride pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy stone. She had spent years pretending to be gentle in front of her husband and neighbors. She could not lose that image now. So, with a strained smile, she lifted the cup. The warm steam curled into her face, carrying that faint bitterness she herself had stirred in. She forced her hand to stop shaking and took a sip. At first, it was only a taste, just enough to show she had drunk. But Naledi's quiet voice pushed her further. "Drink more, Mama. You always tell me tea works best when the cup is finished." The words left Mbalanal cornered. She could not back away now. With a deep breath, she swallowed a larger gulp, her throat tightening as the liquid slid down. First, nothing happened. She placed the cup back onto the tray and tried to smile, but her body betrayed her. Within moments, a cold wave washed over her face. Her lips trembled, her skin drained of color. A sharp pain stabbed her stomach, twisting deep inside like knives. Her eyes widened as the truth struck her. She had swallowed the same poison she had prepared for Naledi. The cup slipped from her hand and crashed against the floor, shattering into pieces. The sound echoed through the house like thunder. Naledi sat still, her hands folded in her lap, watching silently as her stepmother staggered. Mbalanal's breathing grew heavy, sweat beading on her forehead as she clutched her stomach, her proud mask crumbling before the very child she had tried to destroy. The noise drew the attention of the servants. They rushed in, their eyes widening at the sight of Mbalanal, pale and trembling, hunched over the table. One of them gasped loudly, covering her mouth, while another whispered, "The tea! Something was in the tea." Naledi did not move. She only lowered her gaze, hiding the storm of emotions inside her. Fear, relief, sadness, and a strange strength. She had not wished for this ending, but it had come to her stepmother all the same. Mbalanal looked at Naledi then, her eyes wide with both pain and shock. It was as if, in that single moment, she realized she had dug her own grave. The poison she had planned for another now burned in her own veins. The house, once filled with silence, now trembled with whispers and gasps. And Naledi, the girl who had been quiet for so long, finally sat in the middle of it all, no longer the victim, but the one who had survived. The sun was setting when Naledi's father returned from the fields. his clothes dusty and his body heavy with exhaustion. He expected to find the house quiet, perhaps his wife smiling as she usually did when he walked in. Instead, he stepped into chaos. Servants were huddled together, whispering in frightened tones. The smell of spilled tea lingered in the air, and the sound of sobbing echoed from inside the room. He rushed in and found Mbalanal on the floor, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her stomach. The broken pieces of a cup lay scattered beside her, the dark stain of tea spreading across the mat. "What happened?" he cried, dropping to his knees beside her. Mbalanal looked up with wild eyes, pointing a shaking finger at Naledi. "It was her," she wailed. "Your daughter tried to poison me. She wanted me dead." Her voice was filled with desperation, trembling with fear, but also with the craftiness of a woman trying to save herself. Naledi's father froze, his heart twisting. He turned to look at his daughter, who sat silently on the other side of the room. She did not cry or defend herself immediately. Her calmness made his chest tighten even more. Could it be true? He had always trusted his little girl, but Mbalanal's words dug into his mind like thorns. Before he could speak, the servants stepped forward. One of them, an older woman who had worked in the household for years, bowed her head and said firmly, "Master, it was not the girl. We saw with our own eyes. It was your wife who prepared the tea. She brought it to Naledi and insisted she drink. But when Naledi offered it back, she had no choice but to drink it herself." The room fell into heavy silence. Naledi's father looked around at the other servants, his eyes desperate for the truth. One by one they nodded in agreement, whispering the same story. His hands trembled as he turned back to Mbalanal. "Is this true?" he whispered, his voice breaking. Mbalanal shook her head violently, crying harder. "No, they lie. They hate me because I am not the girl's mother. They want to turn you against me." But the panic in her voice betrayed her. Her beauty, once her shield, could not hide the fear in her eyes. Finally, Naledi's father looked at his daughter. She sat with her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes glistening with tears she had held back for so long. He saw no malice in her face, only quiet strength and hurt. In that moment, the truth became clear to him. His heart ached as he realized he had been blind for too long. Tears filled his own eyes as he whispered, "My child, forgive me." His gaze shifted back to his wife, but this time it was filled with disbelief and sorrow. The woman he had brought into his home, the one he thought would care for his daughter, had instead tried to destroy her. And the truth of it broke him more than the long years of labor ever could. The news spread quickly through Cairo, faster than the evening wind. By dawn, everyone knew that something terrible had happened in Naledi's home. Whispers moved from door to door, and soon the elders of the town gathered to settle the matter. They were men and women of wisdom, their voices carrying weight in every household. For generations they had judged disputes, and now they sat in a circle beneath the great fig tree, waiting to hear the truth. Naledi stood quietly by her father's side, her small frame trembling, though her eyes were steady. The servants were called first. One after another they told the same story, that it was Mbalanal who brewed the tea, that it was she who urged Naledi to drink, and that her trembling hands betrayed her guilt when she was forced to sip it herself. Their words fell like stones in the silent air. Mbalanal, dressed in fine clothes that once made neighbors admire her, now looked broken. Her hair was undone, her eyes swollen from crying. She tried to defend herself, insisting it was all a lie, that jealousy had turned the servants against her, that Naledi had tricked her. But her voice shook too much, her words clashed with one another, and the elders could see the fear behind her desperate cries. Finally, the eldest among them, a man whose face carried lines of both kindness and sternness, stood up. His voice was deep and calm, carrying the wisdom of many years. "In this town," he said, "we believe that envy is worse than any sickness. A sickness can be cured, but envy eats the heart until nothing good remains. This woman allowed envy to blind her. She tried to destroy an innocent child, and by her own hands, her crime has been revealed." The people who had once smiled at Mbalanal when she walked proudly through the market now lowered their heads in disgust. Murmurs of anger filled the air. Some women shook their heads, whispering how they had always sensed something false in her sweetness. Others spat on the ground, saying her name should never be spoken again. The elders stripped her of the honor she once carried as the wife of a respected man. She was no longer welcome in gatherings, no longer trusted as a wife or neighbor. Her fine clothes and jewelry meant nothing now. With shame heavy on her shoulders, Mbalanal was sent away, her footsteps echoing with the sound of a life collapsing. As she disappeared from the town, children pointed at her, women whispered curses, and men turned their backs. The same neighbors she once tried to charm with false kindness now wanted nothing to do with her. Her name became a warning, a story mothers told their children. Do not let envy live in your heart, or you will end like Mbalanal. And in the middle of it all stood Naledi, the girl who survived her stepmother's envy, carrying not just her own strength but the lessons of a whole town that had seen how dangerous a poisoned heart could be. After the storm passed and Mbalanal was sent away, Naledi was left standing in the ruins of what had been her childhood. She could have chosen to be angry, to carry hatred in her heart for the rest of her life, but deep inside, she knew bitterness would only chain her to the past. Her mother's memory whispered to her, and her grandmother's words reminded her that true strength was not in revenge but in rising above pain. So Naledi made a choice to grow, to rise, and to transform her suffering into something greater. She poured all her energy into her studies. Books that had once been burned by Mbalanal were replaced by new ones, offered by kind neighbors and teachers who admired her courage. Every morning, she walked to school with determination, her head held high, no longer the quiet girl hiding her pain but someone who carried hope in her steps. When others whispered about her story, she did not bow her head in shame. Instead, she let it fuel her. She wanted to prove that the girl who once sat in silence could stand tall and shine brighter than envy. Years passed, and Naledi's hard work bore fruit. She became a teacher in Kaliro, one of the most respected in the town. Her classroom was not just a place for lessons. It became a sanctuary for girls who felt unheard, girls who had been told their dreams did not matter. Naledi opened doors for them, reminding them that their voices were powerful, their futures valuable. Her story spread across Kaliro. People spoke of her not with pity but with pride. They called her the girl who turned poison into power. It was not just about the night she outsmarted her stepmother. It was about how she refused to let that night define her in bitterness. Instead, she carried the memory as a lesson and a light for others. Many parents began to tell their daughters Naledi's story. They spoke of how she faced envy with wisdom, how she turned pain into purpose, and how she became a woman of dignity. Girls in the town looked at her with shining eyes, seeing in her the proof that they too could rise above whatever hardships life gave them. Naledi never forgot the long nights of sorrow or the quiet tears she once shed. But she also never let them rule her. She understood now that every trial had shaped her into the woman she had become. She no longer carried envy's wound. Instead, she carried its lesson. Years later, Naledi sat in her own office, sunlight streaming through the window as she held a cup of warm tea in her hands. The steam rose gently, carrying her back to the night that had almost ended her life. She remembered the trembling hands of her stepmother, the bitter smell of poison, and the strength it took to stay calm. That memory no longer hurt her. It had become her greatest lesson. Across the room, young girls sat on wooden benches, waiting for her words. They looked at her with hope in their eyes, girls who once thought their voices did not matter. Naledi smiled at them, her heart full of love. She lifted her cup slightly and said in a gentle voice, "Be careful, my daughters. The world may try to poison you with envy, with cruelty, with bitterness. But never let it kill your spirit. Turn every wound into wisdom, every pain into strength." The girls listened closely, their faces glowing with admiration. For them, Naledi was not just a teacher. She was living proof that courage could rewrite any story. She had taken the very cup that was meant to destroy her and turned it into a symbol of survival, a reminder that no darkness could silence a determined heart. In time, Naledi's story spread far beyond her classroom. People across Kaliro spoke of her as the girl who had turned poison into power, the woman who built strength from suffering. Mothers told their daughters, elders told their communities, and soon her story became a legend. And as Naledi sipped the last drop of her tea, she knew the legacy she left behind was stronger than any envy. It was a legacy of hope, and as she stood at the front of her classroom, guiding young girls to dream bigger and walk taller, she knew her journey had only just begun. She had risen from ashes, and her wings now carried many others with